Admit. Something wrong, yeah. Admit all. Admit. Admit all. Hi, Michael. Can you hear me?
Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Great.
So
We were just, I was waiting, but something was wrong, was there, technically?
no, I put it at 7, but the actual start time on the poster is 7:30.
Ah, right, okay, good.
One moment, let me admit everyone.
Yeah.
I'm at right now. I am at the place Literacy Coffee. Welcome everyone. Selamat datang. Bung Ridha, I will request to start your video as well as your audio. Yeah.
Hello, sorry.
Okay. Hi. How are you?
Hi, Mohammed.
Wait, so what happened?
No. We are supposed to start at 7:30, but
Okay.
I started at 7 because sometimes people want to get admitted early.
Okay, sure.
It is in queue, but if I'm not logged in, they won't be able to log in. But 1 minute to 7:30.
Okay.
Yeah. So welcome everyone. Selamat datang. This webinar will be in Indonesian and English, so you can feel comfortable to talk in both languages, and I will translate to the speakers. Should you have any questions in Indonesian to be asked to Michael Roberts here. And let me start. I will start. Our agenda today is a brief introduction by me, Surya Dalimunte, your host, followed by a presentation by Michael Roberts on the global situation, COVID-19 crisis, capitalism, especially later touching a bit on Indonesia, on the economic aspect, and he will be presenting lots of graphs, lots of data, yeah, as he is well known for. And Ridha.
Many graphs.
Yes. I have given the participants on the Facebook for Muhammad Zaki Hussein, I think, the previous presentations for South Africa and India, and you can see a lot of graphs there. And Ridha, at the moment, he is in Northwestern University, PhD student, and he has written lots of works. Later, I will introduce him also in my slides. And he is also an editor, I think, for Left Book Review, yeah, Ridha, at Indo Progress. And he's a very prolific author. And I think we will enjoy Ridha's presentation later on, especially the political aspect of our topic and related solutions, yeah, or proposed what is to be done, some sort of suggestions maybe. And it's 7:30 now. Let me share my screen. I will start by sharing some overview, yeah? Okay. Can you see my screen, Michael and Ridha?
Yes.
Okay. So this is the slides I prepared today. And this is our topic. Let's go to slide 1, yeah? So COVID-19 crisis and capitalism, the Indonesian case. I have lots of affiliation, lots of names also. My full name on my ID is Surya Dharma Hamunangan. I have a surname, Dalimunte, for short, because I'm usually asked for first and last name. So I like to put Surya Dalimunte. And the organization for myself, which I'm organizing this, is under the Intellectual Independent Indonesia, yeah? Indonesian Independent Intellectual. I am at Literacy Coffee. You can see here behind me the founder of Literacy Coffee. Yes, John Fowler, and later I will also introduce him, and perhaps I think I will ask him to speak also a bit. And Literacy Coffee, and we have today our presenters from United Kingdom and United States. Yeah, Roberts is located in UK, and Ridha is in US. So this is Literacy Coffee. Yeah, now it's at night, but on the top left you can see the day view. If you take a picture from outside, so it's very beautiful. It's small, it's cozy, and we have lots of murals of famous Indonesian figures, Indonesian heroes, yeah, including many unnamed or yet to be recognized as they must, as they should, yeah. We have Tan Malaka there, we have Pramudia there, yeah. And you can see below also an event attended by many women. This is on the outside view of the place, yeah. And John is some sort of enthusiast of Batak culture, and you can see he has a book up there on I think it's Batak language, yeah, or culture, John. Budaya Batak atau bahasa Batak di bukunya? On Batak culture, yeah. So the John Fowler Siahan, yeah. That's the website, literacycoffee.com. And let me go to the next slide. Yeah, so John's partner, Lusti, yeah? Lusti, you can see there, she also founded Women Today, an organization called Women Today, which often has many events here. And Literacy Coffee is funded independently, so they are always fundraising. So you can see the fundraising website, Kita Bisa, which is a famous Indonesian fundraising website. And you can access their website, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Yeah, I think John, bisakah dalam bahasa Indonesia memberikan sepatah dua patah kata untuk para peserta kita hari ini? So I will stop my screen share and let John speak first, ya. Please, John.
Oke, selamat malam buat kawan-kawan semuanya. Ya, kenalkan nama saya Tiap Jumat
Bedah.
Saya mencoba sih sebenarnya bagaimana ada sebuah pusat aksi independen di Medan yang berbicara tentang secara lokal, secara Sumatera, secara keseluruhan. Mengingat bahwa hari ini aku lihat masih sangat minim beberapa lembaga yang konsen terhadap isu lokal.
Okay, one moment. I will translate to Michael, yeah. So Literacy Coffee is some sort of an archive. It's a library, especially focusing on local news, local culture, local arts, local music. And there are very few such organization or institution here in Medan. Please continue.
Ya, sehingga pada akhirnya tahun
So they have collected lots of works. They have organized more than 200 events since their founding in 2017, and they have hundreds of books since the 1800 archive here. Okay. So especially the cafe, literacy, coffee, and library, they have helped lots of students, undergraduate students, to finish or to complete their undergraduate thesis because they face difficulties in their own universities to access sources to do their thesis, undergraduate thesis. Okay, John, perhaps 1 last minute, yeah, for you. Unmute, unmute. Thank you very much. John said that he wishes our discussion to be very fruitful, very productive, and lots of ideas and perhaps solutions can come from this discussion. So let me continue sharing my screen on the introduction. Yeah. So Lucy is there. You can't see her, but she's there. Okay. So. So this is our speakers, Michael Roberts, who has written a very rigorous book, yeah, titled The Long Depression, Marxism and the Global Crisis of Capitalism. Basically, Roberts' thesis focuses on the profit rate, yeah, the decline in the sort of permanent decline in the profit rate, which causes evolutions in capitalism all over the world. And Ridha, he has written lots of works, but I chose one of his work here, The State, Class Struggle, and Capitalist Development in Indonesia and South Korea, Marxist View. And he can be found at independent.academia.edu/Ridha, and of course, Indo Progress. So basically, we will go through the COVID-19 crisis, capitalism, and perhaps cure if there is any. Yeah. So this is for the COVID-19. So I will start with an anecdote. Within the past few months, 2 of my friends have died from the disease. Another 2 friends is currently being isolated. And my dad, at the moment, is in the hospital, specialized hospital in Medan for the COVID-19 disease. Yeah, he has been there for 2 weeks. He's recovering, thank God. So I'm praying for his full recovery, which is hope to be another few weeks. Yeah, and so I and several friends met the mayor of Medan 2 weeks ago, and he said that the cost for a patient being admitted or being treated at the hospital is about 70 million rupiah from the start until the end, until the patient is deemed to be cured. But just now I heard an information from a source from the governor, yeah, just now, up to 240 million rupiah. So this is about perhaps 6,000-7,000 or 5,000 to $20,000 yeah, in dollars. And it's very funny in Indonesia that we are so-called entering the new normal, yeah, the age or the era of new normal. But in my town, in fact, it has never been, I mean, we have never experienced something other than the ordinary. So we continue to go out, and even the minister, 2 ministers recently came to Medan, and they said that it seems that Medan has returned to normality. Whereas, as we know, in Medan, that the large-scale social distancing has never been properly monitored, so people are free to go out and interact as before the disease started. And last but not least, right now, we are experiencing what do you call some sort of local and global capitalism, yeah, in the sense that right now it seems that lots of institutions are commercializing the disease by conducting rapid tests, and some, for example, some airlines even, they offer discounted rapid tests. At the hospital, the price for the rapid test is about $30, which is about 350,000 rupiah. But if you go to another region by airline, if you go to the airport, they offer a rapid test, discounted rapid test, 90,000. So you wonder about the effectiveness. And my brothers recently, because of my dad, they were the ones who brought my dad to the hospital. So they had to undergo a PCR, a swab test, yeah, and it cost about 2 million rupiah. So this is a very expensive disease, and lots of problems caused by the disease in terms of how it is being capitalized, seems to be capitalized by Indonesian institutions and organizations, including the governments, yeah. And so you have PDP is an Indonesian term for patient under observation, ya, pasien dalam pengawasan. ODP is orang dalam pemantauan, people who are being asked to isolate themselves, and OTG is orang tanpa gejala, people without symptom. This is the most dangerous because they exhibit no symptom, therefore they're free to move around, and they're the ones who spread the disease to those whose immune system are weak. Yeah. So far, 74,000 people are confirmed to suffer from the COVID-19 disease in Indonesia. About 35,719 people have recovered, and sadly, 3,535 people have died. So we have a crisis in local government budget all over Indonesia, especially in our city, because the budget has been much reduced, because local tax receipt has been much reduced. And lots of regions in Indonesia, they must conduct regional election, and they have no funding for this because they have, even if they have funding, they must increase funding because it is planned that all the election officers should wear protective gears, and the booths are being redesigned to accommodate social distancing procedures. Physical distancing procedures. And therefore, the budget for infrastructure, Indonesian infrastructure is very bad. So you have to have a maintenance budget every year to maintain the infrastructure. Now they are not being maintained because the budget has been redirected to tackle the COVID-19 crisis. So we can see in our city, for example, lots more flooding and lots more crumbling roads, broken roads, yeah. And everywhere, actually, PSBB is Indonesian for large-scale social restriction. So this has ended effectively. The head of police of Indonesia has stated that this has ended, so people are free to mix around, to go out, but it is not effective. Even during the social restriction period, it was not effective, and now we can see the number of people has skyrocketed who suffers or who contracts the disease. Unemployment, of course, increased by a lot. This is the largest or the most number of projection, yeah, by LIPI. Up to 25 million people will be unemployed by the end of 2020. I have the sources. If you want, I can send it to you later. So lots of conflicts on the streets at Mandailing Natal regency. People block the roads. the local citizens there, local people there block the roads because they complain that they don't receive assistance as much as they should. Yeah? And also in Java, lots of similar cases, yeah, demonstrations regarding the financial assistance and food assistance. And direct stimulus to the people have been recommended by economists, intellectuals, elites of all ideologies. But the government seems not to hear all these recommendations. Even the mainstream, the so-called neoclassical or neoliberal intellectuals or economists, they have recommended direct stimulus, yeah, to the people, but these suggestions have been unheeded so far. Let me meet these people, yeah. Okay. All right, and now to the capitalism aspect of our topic. So I would like to begin by saying that, quoting this, around 1600, some of the richest parts of the world were in the East: China, Indonesia, India, and Japan. This is by Roger van Zwanenburg, The Struggle for World Power in Critical Muslim. And Ted Sprague, yeah, he has written on the history of capitalism in Indonesia in 2010. Recently, Zoe Milanovi, The Netherlands and Decolonization of Indonesia, 8 June 2020. And a few days ago, or perhaps 1 week ago, about a week ago, Budiman Minasni, yeah, The Dark History of Slavery and Racism in Indonesia during the Dutch colonial period. So historical materialism, in a sense that path dependence, yeah, what Indonesia today is decided or it depended on its previous path. Even we must understand Indonesia's history, especially materially, to understand what is our real problem and how to solve it. Yeah. And so here, this is from Alec Gordon, the late Alec Gordon. Lots of foreign experts, be they historians or economists, they describe Indonesia I think not objectively. For example, Gordon criticized in his review of this book, An Economic History of Indonesia, 1800 to 2010, by famous Dutch historians, economic historians, yeah, Jan Luiten van Zanden and his student Dan Marx. So he said that in his review, this author said that the 1945-1965 exclusion as the lost decades. So Gordon, the late Alec Gordon, criticized, to whom were these decades lost? And Gordon suggested that the loss during that period, revolutionary period, was imperialisms. Yeah, and similar book here, the Indonesian economy in the 19th century and 20th centuries, A History of Missed Opportunities by Ian Booth. Yeah, so missed opportunities. Why? Who missed these opportunities? So we must find other books. Fortunately, there are many other books on Indonesian economic history which can enlighten us. Yeah, by Thomas Lindblad, by Howard Dick, I think, by even Tae Kian Wee. Yeah, we can get the facts from those books, even though perhaps the interpretation may not be to our liking. Yeah, and Gordon concluded by saying that this book has neglected any real engagement with Marxian, neo-Marxian, and dependency theories, and is merely another contribution to what is a degenerative research program that characterizes modern neoclassical economics. So we really need an engagement here in Indonesia, especially because of our history with Marxian and neo-Marxian and world system theorists, yeah, dependency theorists, to be able to diagnose Indonesia's problems and to offer useful solutions. Yeah. Here on the right side, Gordon's estimates of the amount of surplus extracted from Indonesia during the colonial period. Yeah, there are 5 works there, and I think this is, yeah, I think this is my last slide. Yeah, Intan Swandi, her book, Value Chains: The New Economic Imperialism. So this book has won many awards. Yeah, not only the one mentioned there. So this book examined the exploitation of labor and class in the global South, using Indonesia as a case study, yeah? Using Indonesian suppliers. And it is very interesting because this book examined concrete processes through which multinational corporations located primarily in the global North capture value from the global South, yeah? How they enforce economical and flexible production, including labor management methods, aim to reassert the imperial dominance of the North while continuing the dependency of the global South. And this power must be broken if the global working class, if the Indonesian working class is to liberate ourselves, yeah? And this book is very useful because it puts labor and class back at the center of our understanding of the world capitalist system. Especially now in Indonesia, we have the omnibus laws, you know, which makes it easier for investments, foreign investments, foreign capital to enter Indonesia. And lots of protests, but it seems that the government and the executive branch and the legislative branch of the Indonesian governments continues to power through to force the law to be issued, to be released within 100 days. So within 1 or 2 months, we can expect this law to be ratified by the House of Representatives. So this is very worrying. So I hope with all this analysis later, even if we do not come up with solutions, we can see some solutions, or we can imagine at least what are the real problems. We can imagine at least the solutions to the very real problems facing us now. So thank you very much. I will pass the floor or the webinar to Michael Roberts, please.
Well, thank you, Surya, for an opening account of the general issues involved in what's happened in Indonesia, and for that matter, what's happened in the global South. And clearly, there's quite a lot of literature that you've collected and other people have, which can explain a lot of the history of not only Indonesian capitalism and its suppression by global imperialism, but also the rest of the world as well. What I want to do in my contribution to this very, very useful discussion, it's not often you get an opportunity to discuss with people on the ground in various parts of the world, but particularly in Indonesia in this case, about what's going on and how that's affecting a major economy, because Indonesia has 270 million people, I think, to the latest figures, and it's a member of the G20, which is the club of the top 19 economies, because the 20th is the European Union, that meet on occasion to discuss world affairs and in particular discuss the strategy for international capitalism. And Indonesia is part of that, one of the, if you like, major I'm sorry about that. That's not me. It's somebody called Sharabu Shikara. Needs to mute. Anyway, so what I want to talk about is what's happening in global capitalism under the COVID, how that's affecting Indonesian capitalism and the economy there and the people in it. And then perhaps with Mohammed's discussion coming through later, we'll have a much more comprehensive picture on the issues that we need to discuss. So like Surya, I'm going to try and share a screen without too many mistakes. I hope this works. The host needs to allow me to share the screen. I'm blocked off at the moment. Surya, can you release that? No, I'm still disabled from my screen. Surya, you need to release the screen to everybody. Yeah, that's it.
Can you now? Okay.
Yeah, we're fine. You should be able to see it now. Right, can you see that?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. So let me start by talking about the current situation. And which, you know, in the world, there has been a major lockdown of nearly all the economies in the world as a result of the spread of the COVID-19 virus and the inability of health systems around the world to cope with it and to avoid a massive increase in deaths and serious illness for a load of people, particularly old people or people who already have medical problems, it seems. So this has forced governments with inadequate health systems to introduce full or partial lockdowns. And as of last month, something like 2.7 million workers were affected by a full or a partial lockdown. 81% of the world's 3.3 billion workers were affected by that, even in countries where, on the whole, infection rates have been low and death rates even lower. This lockdown is unprecedented, unparalleled. We haven't seen anything like this. Originally, it was thought was going to be a contraction of about 3 to 5% in global GDP. The latest estimates by the IMF, the OECD, and the World Bank suggest it's going to be even higher than that, and certainly worse than in the Great Recession of 2008-9. In the lockdowns, output in most economies, according to the OECD, will fall by 25% this year, and up to 1/3 in some of the sectors in the major economies. I'll show you a bit later the latest estimates for 2020, but they're truly staggering in the reduction in GDP by the end of the year. And for each month of containment, which has been on average about 3 months, there's going to be a loss of 2 percentage points in annual GDP. The short-term collapse in this output, according to one American economist, is equivalent and is passing anything we've seen in the last 150 years. That also applies insofar as we can see later on to the figures in Indonesia. And according to the IMF chief, Kristalina Georgieva, we now predict that over 170 countries will experience negative per capita income growth. That means that the income per person in the country will fall during 2020 in over 170 countries. And that includes Indonesia, as we shall see. And one of the clear things that comes to me from this reading and following Marx is he makes a very simple point that value, what's produced and what people can create in order to improve their living and also for the profits of capitalism, depends primarily on people going to work. There is no other way in which you can produce value. And as Marx says, every child knows if a nation ceases to work, even if it's not for a year, but even for just a few months or weeks, would perish. And that's certainly been proven by this COVID crisis and the lockdown that's taken place. If there's one thing we've learned from COVID immediately is that it's up to human beings, and particularly working people, who set the tone for improvements in living standards and conditions and social needs around the world. It's not due to the people who appropriate that value, distribute it amongst themselves, and live off it. Only labor creates value. And we've seen that the point I want to make is that this pandemic was not a bolt out of the blue. It was not like an asteroid hitting the Earth. It couldn't have been expected. Pandemics have been increasing for the last 25, 30 years as new viruses, which haven't come into the contact with the human beings, have started to affect them. This has come about through the industrialization of most of the world, logging, oil exploration, industrial farming, all those things, many of which you experienced in Indonesia, has led to the more remote parts of the world, and where there are wild animals who've been keeping these pathogens in their bodies for thousands of years, have now come closer to human contact. And it seems through a process of jumping from wild animals into domesticated animals, industrial production and farming, and then into food markets, that these pathogens have begun to enter the human bodies. There's been a series of them. This is just the latest one, and there are probably more to come. The United Nations have warned that these pandemics were coming, but most countries and governments ignored that, thought they could carry on just as before. They didn't need to prepare for such pandemics. And so they were hit hard when it did happen. But the other reason we have to remember why there has been such a slump is not just the pandemic and the virus, but also the fact that on the whole, world economy, major economies in the world were slowing down over this longest period we've seen since the Great Recession of 2009. It's been a 10-year period of expansion, of the longest expansion on record, but the weakest expansion on record. It's been a very low growth rate, very low investment rate, very low productivity, very low wage increases on the whole internationally. And as a result, and yet, just as we got to 2019, growth was slowing down in most of the major economies, at least of the global north, to under 2%, heading towards 1%. Europe was virtually in recession. Japan was in a slump. And even the emerging economies, like Indonesia and others, were slowing down as well, as the figures will show in a minute. So we were already entering probably a new economic slump, and the pandemic and the lockdowns have just accelerated and concentrated and extended that process, not only in depth, but also in breadth, so that over virtually the whole world, for the first time, has been involved in a slump. And we can see here on this figure, there's been the globalist economy has just dropped off a cliff edge. Both the advanced economies have gone negative, and for the first time since the 1960s, emerging economies have gone negative in 2020. Here's a graph by the OECD of each country and their expected decline in growth. You can see on the left-hand side, something like 10 to 12%. I think the scale is missing, but it's around 10 to 12% for Spain, France, Italy, the UK. And then if you work down the list, you will find all the other countries, all in negative area, including India down the bottom there for the very first time. And as we'll see also Indonesia. And the part of the reason it's affected not just the advanced capitalist economies, with all, as it did in the Great Recession of 2008-9, it's also this time we've seen a massive collapse in trade and in commodity prices, already beginning before the COVID, but now has extended to a huge drop in trade and commodity prices and the ability to sell commodities because everything is locked down. And for countries like Indonesia, for countries like most of the commodity resource-based countries in Latin America, then this is serious. This means that even if the COVID is not extensive in their own country, it means they can sell nowhere else because products prices have collapsed, trade has collapsed. So this is just a contagion effect across the world. And here, for the first time, we get an estimate that emerging markets GDP growth will be negative in 2020, the first time, as I say, certainly since the early 1960s, if not before, since reliable records began, really. We don't really have records for the so-called emerging markets until the last 60 or 70 years, and we can see that for the first time, they're entering a negative period. And by the way, that developing economy slump includes China and India, the two biggest global South economies, which in the Great Recession, certainly in the case of China, remained positive in their growth rates during the period of the Great Recession, and India more or less too. Now, both of those have been forced into a fall in GDP in 2020. And yet the COVID pandemic is not over. Here's the latest figures, I think, from yesterday, which show that daily new cases on a 7-day moving average, the left-hand chart, are over 200,000 a day now, on average, which is an indication that the infection continues to spread, particularly in countries where there's no real attempt now to try and control or contain it, like the United States, but also spreading to other countries which up to now haven't had it before, South Africa, India, Brazil, Latin America in general. And on the right-hand side, you can see the daily deaths still remain above 5,000 a day on average. Yes, they've come down a little bit, but if you look closely, you can see there isn't really much of a fall in the death rate as it expands across the world. So we're seeing deaths per day remaining very high because of the increasing number of cases. In Indonesia, I just had a quick look at the figures. We can see this the same thing, that the pandemic is rising in Indonesia. Daily new cases per day, now up close to, 2,000 a day, on some of the latest figures, still rising. Of course, deaths aren't very high. We know that the reason for this is probably two reasons. One, it seems that anybody under the age of 50 or under the 40 who doesn't have any medical problem existing already is unlikely to be severely affected by being infected with the COVID-19 virus. But all those who have some medical problem or are ancient and old, like myself, are in serious risk of getting severely ill, being hospitalized, and possibly dying. So while the cases spread to areas where the population is relatively younger, then the daily deaths appear to be not rising at the same ratio so far. But of course, many countries that have lots of young people also have lots of unhealthy people because of the conditions under which they live. So there's a real danger that the death rate could start to rise if the pandemic continues to spread in the way it is. So the point being made here is that the global pandemic from COVID-19, as of July 2020, having started in January, is not over. It may be under control in most countries in Europe, but it's still there. In the case of the United States, Latin America, it's still increasing sharply. And in Asia, there's also some signs of pickup in those countries which are unable to control it. Here is the latest deaths per million of COVID-19. You can see just in that yellow block there, that's the deaths per million in the US and the UK. 408 deaths per million of population. The US has 350 million or so. So you can add that up to get your total number of deaths. But 408 deaths per million. The UK is at 657 deaths per million, the second highest in the world. So Asian death rates per million are much, much lower. But you can see, if you want to take it within the area of the Asian region, that Indonesia is relatively high compared to other countries like Japan, Korea, even Thailand, Taiwan, and Vietnam, and China, of course, where the pandemic started, is actually very low because of their ability to control it. But countries like India are not really controlling the pandemic, so deaths per million are continuing to rise there as cases rise, and it looks as though Indonesia may be in the same boat as the Philippines. And this is the big point about the economic development. This lockdown is just certain to drive up poverty levels around the world, particularly in the global south. There are possibly, according to the World Bank, something like 500 million people could be driven back below the World Bank's poverty line as a result of the lockdowns of the economic collapse. The World Bank's poverty line, by the way, of $1.90 per day is pathetically low. Nobody possibly could live on that except starve. A more realistic figure of $5.50 per person per day would suggest that even more people could be driven into poverty as a result of a 20% collapse in the incomes of the poorest people in the world. And East Asia has half of that 500 million, and South Asia another 128 billion, according to these figures. That's an indication of how serious it is for people at home, in the street, driven with work closing down and already close to the poverty line. And Indonesia is not a rich country. If you look at the GDP figures per person here, ranked by the IMF and the World Bank, you can see that in Southeast Asia, Indonesia has about $14,000 per person income or national income. That's the income per capita, $14,000, way less than Thailand or Malaysia, and only somewhat above the Philippines and other countries there. And in China, for example, with 1.5 billion people, 1.3 billion people, is way, way better off per person than Indonesia. So this Indonesia is still struggling to provide the basic needs of its 270 million people and the adults working in that environment. And now we have the COVID slump hitting them really hard. It's estimated that 60% of the world's employed population are in the informal economy. So that means they don't have salaries or wages coming directly from employers, so that they're well recorded. It's all done by cash. It's all on a casual employment basis or a temporary basis or limited contracts, a cash economy, which means there is no backup in terms of sick pay, welfare benefits, or any support if you lose your job or you lose your livelihood in your business. And all the countries and selected Asian countries have this very high level of informal sector employment. Indonesia, something like 2/3 of Indonesian workers are in the informal sector, which is a staggeringly high figure because it means that they are very, very vulnerable to this collapse in economic prosperity. In addition, Indonesia is one of the most unequal societies in the world. If you look at the chart on the left-hand side, you can see that there are some countries where the richest 1% have higher than Indonesia. The richest 1% in Russia have 75% of all the wealth, personal wealth in that economy. India, the richest 1%, have 58%. But Indonesia is also very high. Nearly half of the personal wealth in Indonesia is held by the top 1%. And if you look on the right-hand side, you can see the top 10%, or the Gini index, which is the measure of inequality. And Indonesia, in looking across Southeast Asia, is nearly as high as Thailand in its level of wealth inequality. So we're talking about the inequality of wealth, what people have as their possessions, whether it's a home, whether it's some articles that, like a car and so on, or even, very unlikely, some savings in the bank or stocks and shares. The result is, of course, that all that wealth is concentrated in a very, very small number of people. So the vast majority of people in Indonesia and in other countries own little or nothing, and a very, very small number of people own virtually everything. Here is the income ratio. That's the inequality of income in Indonesia, with two lines showing where the Asian financial crisis was in 1998, and then the global financial crash of 2008-9. And you can see that the inequality ratio, which is the Gini ratio, had been increasing in Indonesia since the beginning of this century and reached a height in the 2015 period. It's come down a little bit since then, but it's still really at record highs in terms of inequality compared to where Indonesia was even back in the terrible days of the 1970s. So inequality of wealth, inequality of income, everybody living on the margin with informal employment. This is the situation for the vast majority of working people in Indonesia as this COVID pandemic and this global slump hits. And one of the issues here is that if you have an informal economy, hardly anybody pays any taxes because everything is cash. Nothing goes through to be recorded, to be taxed. But even more important, basically, the Indonesian government does not tax the rich. They hold most of the wealth, they hold most of the income, but they're not really taxed. The tax to GDP ratio in Indonesia is the lowest in much of the major Asian economies around. It's not very high, even in India and China at 16 or 20% tax to GDP ratio. The ratios, by the way, in Europe and in the global north is anything between 25 and 40%. But the ratios in these countries is well below 20%. In the case of Indonesia, it's hardly above 10%. So the government has no money to spend to improve conditions for the common good, if that's what it was going to use the money for, because it doesn't get enough tax out of the very rich, mainly, and because everybody else struggles to make a living, tries to avoid paying tax as best they can. So here we are right now in the COVID into 2020. You can see the last GDP growth figure we have for Indonesia is that it's sliding fast. It's still positive, but I can assure you by the time we get the figures for the second quarter of this year, which ended in June, just a couple of weeks ago, then we'll see a negative growth rate in Indonesia like elsewhere. And then we'll see whether it can struggle to turn that around, given that the world trade and commodity prices continue to flounder, and Indonesia's basic support for growth will not be there to continue with world trade. Economic activity, that's the measure of activity being carried out by Indonesian manufacturers and service sector has just totally collapsed. There's a little bit of a recovery in the last month or so, but you can see it's well below the normal level. Anything above 50 means some sort of growth in economic activity. Anything below 50 on this index means a serious contraction. And the further down you are, the faster is the contraction. As long as if you're still under 50, an economy is still contracting. So even though that figure has jumped a little bit, it still means that the Indonesian economy is going down, and we will see in the second quarter the results of that. And of course, Indonesian households have stopped spending for two reasons. They haven't got any money because they're not working, large numbers of them. I think Sharia said something like 25% unemployment. But also, they perhaps are afraid to spend money on things that otherwise would put them at risk of getting infection when they go out, whether it's traveling, whether it's meeting other people and so on. So consumer spending, just like in many other countries, has collapsed at the moment. And the issue is, well, if that doesn't come back, and manufacturing doesn't come back, and exports don't come back, then you're in for a serious damage to the economy. And this is a commodity-based economy. Here's a little graph which shows you in the top right-hand corner that 23% of India's GDP comes from mineral fuels, oils, distillation products, and so on. You know better than me what that means, the sort of industry that Indonesia has as its base to create value. But also another 11% comes from various agricultural basic products, oils and so on, which have come from the land, which are exploited out of the land. And then you can see also in the top right-hand corner, various minerals and so on. So if you add all that together, you're getting something like 40 to 45% of the economy depends on basic fuels, oils, agricultural and oil products. And the prices of all those have taken a huge plummet in the last 6 months. And unless they return, then Indonesia's reasonable growth rate, which it's had to try and match its fast-growing population of 3 to 5% a year over the last 10 years, is in serious jeopardy, not just this year, but in future years. And the problem is that although Indonesia depends on a capitalist sector to get its value up by the exploitation of the workers involved in that, that capitalist sector is really not making much of a return. The multinationals that have invested in Indonesia are increasingly finding it difficult to get a decent rate of profit as they expand the level of machinery, plant and equipment they apply relative to labor. A lot of the industries that the multinationals have invested in Indonesia don't require a lot of labor, or they look for cheap labor because they're oil refineries and other products, or where they do, they don't return the sort of return they were expecting. That's particularly the case since the Asian financial crisis. But we can see back before that, going way back, this is, if you like, the rate of profit for Indonesian capital in the economy as a whole was averaging around about 20% compared to the investment stock placed in it. But after the Asian financial crash, there was a huge drop and there hasn't really been any recovery. That means it's extremely difficult for Indonesian capital to recover from this slump on its own. It requires a massive bailout, or it requires actually the removal of Indonesian capital and its replacement by government and state investment to boost the economy. If Indonesia continues to rely on incentives to Indonesian capital and the multinationals to try and get them out of this slump, because the profitability is so low, they will not get the responding investment that they require to boost growth, boost productivity, and create new jobs at reasonable rates, but not just on the informal economy. They will stagger on in the same way they have done for the last 25 years. Corporate profitability, according to the IMF staff estimates, you can see, confirms the previous graph. You can see it slipping from 18% or so, according to the IMF in 2011, down a little bit of a recovery now, but with 2019 it fell, 2020 will fall more. It continues to decline, making it very difficult to see much improvement we can expect in capitalist production in Indonesia. And the other issue is that if the prices of your exports are collapsing, but you still have to pay back debt that you've built up previously, that have been through investment or through corporations bringing in investment, or a government borrowing money, or companies borrowing money from international banks in order to grow. Then private external debt is increased across the board in various sectors on the left-hand graph there over the last 10 to 15 years since the Great Recession. And that debt is all in dollars. If the rupiah has been collapsing, which it has because of commodity prices, then that debt is very much more difficult to pay. And you can see on the right-hand scale, the IMF can see an increase in the problem loans. Companies, even before we get to the COVID, were starting to have difficulty in Indonesia in meeting their debts, despite low interest rates, because everything is measured in dollars. And if they can't pay back their loans in dollars, then they're in the danger of defaulting on their debt or not paying in the time, putting pressure on the banks. And now, with the fall in production, trade, and commodity prices, that red line on the right-hand scale is going to shoot up, and the overall bars on the left-hand scale are also going to shoot up, increasing the pressure and difficulty of meeting debts. What help are they getting? The IMF may be able to offer them money in a crisis, but it'll be limited, and that will put them probably under pressure to meet the terms of the IMF, which will require paying that back over time. So it puts tremendous pressure on the Indonesian national economy if it's placed in a position where it has to go into an IMF program in order to try and meet the external debt figures we can see here and avoid too much rise in problem loans. Can the government spend money to boost the economy if the capitalist sector won't in Indonesia? Well, if you look down this list, there's been some huge increases in fiscal spending by many European and global north countries in trying to bail out both companies and workers to some extent and try and keep the economy going during the pandemic lockdown. But if you look on the right-hand side of the scale, you can see it's mainly global south or emerging economies. That means that they just don't have the funds to spend in order to compensate for the loss of jobs, lockdown, the closure of production and investment. Indonesia is only government spending 2.6% of GDP, and you can compare that to, say, the US at 8% or Hong Kong at 10%. Indonesia is not in a position to make the sort of spending that would get them out through government investment or government spending. They just don't have the resources. And the international organizations of the IMF, World Bank, and so on, or the Asian Development Bank, cannot provide anything like extra help to achieve that. And that applies not just to Indonesia, but also to most of Southeast Asia and Latin America and the other countries. And as I say, the capitalist system overall was already in difficulty. And I think, just finish on this, Ridha and everybody else, not to go on too long, but to make the point that this COVID pandemic has driven the world economy into an unparalleled slump. But already the world economy was slowing down. Already the profitability of the major sectors of the capitalist global economy was at very low levels. We were in a long depressed rate of profit and in growth and production for the major economies before the COVID came. And that means unless there's a dramatic increase in the profitability of the capitalist sector internationally, it'll be a real struggle to get out of this slump. It will make it very, very much more difficult to achieve a return to anything like what might be regarded as normal in Indonesia or anywhere else. Not normal for the majority of the population, but even normal for capitalist growth. Corporate profits globally were flat or dead or zero or falling before the COVID hit. This is a measure of all the major economies' corporate profits, doesn't include Indonesia's, of course. I'm talking about the top economies, and you can see that already were in difficulty before that. So, and we're expecting now, I've just seen the latest figures, that global corporate profits, that's the profits that big corporations make around in the major economies, are going to fall by something like 25% this year. So you can see that that black line is going to go further, well down to the bottom, below the -20 there in this coming year. That's going to be very difficult to recover from. And what it means is you get a permanent loss of output. Here's the IMF's estimate if you see that black line running from 2018 from left to right, that was the sort of trend growth rate that the global economy was achieving before the COVID hit. And then we get the slump as a result of the COVID. According to IMF, it drops down from the 100 point in 2019 to 94, 95. I think they're saying 94 now. And then there supposedly is going to be a recovery, but it may not be a recovery which is achieved for several years. So will that blue shadowed area, something like $12 trillion, which is equivalent to something like 13%, 14% of world GDP, over that period of time is lost forever. You can't get that back. That's not returning to the previous growth rate, even if that's possible in 2 or 3 years' time, still means that all those jobs, incomes, products, resources have been lost to the world during the period of the slump and its recovery. That's what slumps do. People forget, they think, oh, it's slump down, then you come out of it and you carry on before. Yes, but the slump means, whether it's a V or a L or whatever, that means that cumulative output loss is lost forever. And there's not going to be a V-shaped recovery, in my view. Here is the estimates made by the OECD. If things go well, then maybe by the end of 2024, you'll be sort of recovering to some extent. But if you have a double hit, in fact, you could go with a new virus outwave, or the lockdowns continue longer, or we get into a financial crisis as a result of the slump, then there will be no return to this previous trend growth rate, which, as I just said earlier, was some of the lowest growth rates we've seen since records began in the last 50 or 60 years. So a growth rate where back in the 1960s and 70s, economies could grow, global economies growing, say, at 4 or 5%. In the 1990s, maybe 5 or 6%. In the 2000s, 3 or 4%. After the global financial crash, global economy was growing at about 2 to 3%. Now we're not going to see that trend growth rate anymore. We're going to be in a position where it's basically way lower than that. So entry, as it were, a very low investment rate. This is the investment rate for all the major OECD economies, and that shows you how much it's going to fall. The investment rate was already very low anyway, and now this COVID slump is going to drive capitalist investment almost down to zero. So there'll be no improvement, no recovery, which will be recognizable to the majority of us in order to develop resources and improve social needs, even if that was fairly shared, which of course it isn't. And yet the corporations of the big multinationals and around the world are increasing their debt to overcome this. So they have a very high level of debt, which means that they're in the position where they could easily have bankruptcies and defaults if there's any rise in the debt servicing costs, which are low at the moment, but if they were to rise as a result of any sort of recovery or inflation returns, then you would be in a serious situation for many companies. So what I'm saying is you've had a supply shock, a collapse in production. Then you've had a demand shock, a collapse in spending and investment. Now you could have a financial crash because many companies go bust or won't pay their debts, and then the banks will be in trouble again. In my book, finish on this, my book, The Long Depression, I argued that what we're in there since 2008 has been a depression as opposed to a recession. As you can see on the top 3 points, there are different sorts of recovery after a slump. The normal one is a V shape, which is what most governments are hoping for now, and what the capitalist strategists are hoping for. Sometimes you get a W shape. It goes up and it collapses again, as in the 1980s. Or you get a depression, which is like a reverse square root. It's the other way around for a square root. Those you know your basic arithmetic, and what a square root looks like. This is the reverse sign of it. And you can see you don't return to trend. You stay on a new lower level. And that's happened on 3 times, in my view, in the history of capitalism. The late 19th century, we saw that in the Great Depression, and no return to the trend growth until war began. And now, in the last 10 years, it's something similar. It seems we're about to enter a new leg of a long depression, where that trend growth rate, which you can see in the dotted blue line, before 2008, was replaced by a new trend growth rate, the first leg of the long depression, the yellow dotted line, and then with these collapse in the COVID and the recovery, we could end up on that red line, which is a completely new and lower trajectory. And the loss in between the blue dotted line and the red line in terms of growth is truly huge over the next 10 years if that's what's going to happen. That is the prospect for world capitalism. And of course, that affects Indonesian capitalism. There is no escape for Indonesia. They depend on the world in particular and what happens there. So if world capitalism remains in a depression, that can only damage the ability of Indonesia to grow, to meet the needs of its huge population. Already, the inequality of wealth and income is there. This will only tend to get worse, and the lowest majority of the population will fail to see any prosperity out of Indonesia if that's how the situation continues. That's it from me. I finished. Going to be your turn now, Mohammed, I think.
Oh, sorry. I thought that Surya will make some introduction first. So thank you, Surya and Michael, for the presentation. And I hope that my presentation won't be repeat much from all of you guys, because yeah, definitely some of the content of my presentation has already been said in both of your presentations. So basically what I want to say is more about politics, particularly about the politics of the capitalist class in Indonesia in the context of pandemic right now. So yeah, wait, I need to share my where is my presentation? Can you guys see it? I think, yeah.
Yeah, I think you're nearly there. You just have to open it up.
Yeah,
There we go. That's it.
Okay, sure. Okay, thank you. So, okay. So basically, what happens in Indonesia cannot be separated from the political character of Indonesian capitalist state itself. So there are two main important traits that embedded in the Indonesian capitalist state. The first one is the authoritarian legacy, which basically makes the state insulated from any popular aspiration. And these things have been generated, nurtured during the Suharto's authoritarian power. And although Indonesia successfully transformed itself into a democratic state, this kind of legacy did not really vanish. So after Suharto being toppled, the structure, the power structure that sustained Suharto is still there. So that's why even we already have this kind of more or less 21 years of democratic reform, we still have to face this concrete material structure of authoritarian, the so-called authoritarian legacy, in which the power of the state being dominated by only merely several class power, whether you want to call it as a capitalist class or oligarch. Yeah, you can say it as you wish. And the second one is related to neoliberalism. So basically, after the 97-98 crisis, the very foundation of the economic structure in Indonesia transformed radically, which previously only controlled by the state due to authoritarian politics. But then after the crisis, all of this structure has to be transformed into more market-friendly economic structure. So that's why we have these two political structure that really interrelated in current Indonesia's capitalist state, and it makes So that's why we have really so-called ignorant elite in the top of the government, which basically related to this legacy, authoritarian legacy. And the second one is we have this kind of lack of public infrastructure because of this neoliberalism. And so that's why during the crisis, the government only provide, you can say, insufficient stimulus in order to maintain the economy of the Indonesia. The government provide 405 trillion rupiah, in which if you convert it into US dollar, I think it's around 300 million, something like that. And unfortunately, this stimulus is focusing more on how to sustain the economy, or you can say the capitalist economy in Indonesia. So you can see that there are four main posts that really want to be allocated in here. Most of the posts is related to economic development. Although you can see it in here is 75 trillion rupiah and 100 trillion rupiah. If you see in the detail in the document, most of the stimulus not necessarily related to the livelihood of the people. So that's why the stimulus is really insufficient to provide a comprehensive and systematic social protection for the people during the pandemic. And this is the result. Because we don't have comprehensive social protection, we have this kind of things where confirmed positive cases for coronavirus is always increasing. And if you compare it to other country, the situation is staggering, because basically in Indonesia, the will of the government to provide protection is really low. So you can see in here the comparison number of COVID-19 tests per 1 million population in one of the world's most populated countries. Indonesia is only better than Nigeria, in which if you compare in the economic scale, it's much lower than Indonesia. Even countries like Pakistan and Bangladesh, they are more successful to provide protection through testing for their own citizen. And what explains this discrepancy, the inability of the government? It's related, once again, and I think Michael has already addressed in here. It's related to the money. It's related to the resource allocation, right? So if you can see in here, the proportion of public and private health expenditure in Indonesia, most of the expenditure coming from the private sector. Although you can see in 2017, I make some mistake in here, sorry. In 2017, there is a quite significant increase, but relative to the total number, the proportion of health expenditure in Indonesia is still dominated by the private sector. So that's why, in terms of infrastructure, Indonesia doesn't have, let's say, sufficient or even necessary infrastructure that can be used to protect their own citizens during the pandemic. And I suggest, this is just my opinion, but in 2013, there's a research on health infrastructure in Indonesia, and I found that there are three types of problem that related to health infrastructure in Indonesia. The first of all is related to the numbers of the human resource in Indonesia. So basically, in Indonesia, we have a lack of number of general doctors. So if we follow the international standard that provided by the WHO, a nation should have 40 general doctors per 100,000 people. However, in Indonesia, they only have 33 general doctor per 100,000 Indonesians. And also it's related to the number of hospital. So once again, I just followed the standard that provided by the WHO in here. So the ratio for the hospital beds in Indonesia is only around 6.3 per 10,000 people. This number was far from the standard, which a country or a nation should provide 30 beds per 10,000 people if you want to be considered as a nation according to the standard, to the international standard. And the last one is problem of unequal development in health sector. You can say that most of the health infrastructure that takes place in Indonesia concentrated only in Java and Bali. Other places like Sumatra, Nusa Tenggara, and even Papua, they have really insufficient number of medical worker. So that's why we can see that in here, the government or even the state, they don't have any, they don't have instrument at their disposal to handle this pandemic, and it all has to do with because Indonesian capitalism itself. And so that's why during this crisis, we have this kind of two type of crisis that most of the people will see it as unconnected, but I think it's really strongly connected between each other. We have the crisis at the economic level, and also the livelihood. The economic level, Michael has present us very brilliantly about how the rate of the fall of the rate of the profit, economic growth, and everything at the formal national level in Indonesia, which you can say that there's a strong weaknesses in Indonesian economic, which govern in the logic of capitalism. But at the same time, we have this kind of day-to-day crisis, which related to the unemployment, declining income, even the deterioration of health among the Indonesian population. So with these things in mind, we have this kind of class struggle that takes place in Indonesia. The problem is the struggle occur in a different way, and it's related to one important things, and which I think, as Michael has already said about, it's all about the labor, because profit in capitalism always coming from the labor. And for the capitalist class, the important things is right now is to strengthening the domination of the capitalists in controlling labor of the working class. And the methods that they introduce in here, definitely by promoting several pro-business legislation that not only strengthening the domination of the capitalist class, but also strengthening the repressive apparatus of the class of the state itself. So you can see that there are several new laws that has been introduced, like the omnibus law, which basically a law that tried to overcome all law in Indonesia that considered as preventing any capital accumulation right now. And the second one is mineral and natural resources, which basically, as previous presentation before, because mineral and natural resources is one of the sector that important for the Indonesian economy, the capitalist class needs to ensure that the accumulation through exploitation of natural resources can be takes place without any prevention, any challenge from, particularly from the people. right now. So that's the type of the class struggle that coming from the capitalist class, but also we have another type of class struggle that coming from the working class. Our and this kind of struggle, although they are quite obvious, but they are emerged not really, you can say, structured or even organized. So more of this struggle coming into more like spontaneous way in order for the working class to cope with the crisis that happens because of the pandemic, like normative struggle at the factory level. This is quite usual for the labor movement in a capitalist economy. And interestingly, there are several type of, you can say, not necessarily new, but quite obvious during the pandemic crisis, like mutual aid, urban farming, and also several scattered mobilization against anti people state legislation like this omnibus law and mineral and natural resources law. So you can say that at the working class there's some resistance, there's some attempt from the working class itself in order to reclaiming their labor from the domination and exploitation of the current existing capitalist system that takes place in Indonesia. And I kind of want to focus to the experience of mutual aid because it is quite interesting because it tries to provide a new way of thinking about how we can understand class struggle in non-conventional way. Although this idea is not necessarily new, it's already been promoted by thinkers like Kropotkin. But I think there's a important value that we need to be highlight in here about the importance to move beyond your own issue, move beyond your own sectoral ego. And I found this experience is quite illuminating in how we can understand to move our agenda for class struggle in Indonesia. So we can see in here, there's some cases like in capital city of Jakarta, where several people organize crowdfunding campaign to raise funds to support workers from informal sector, and also some people in Yogyakarta. And interestingly, although you can say this might not have some sort of political impact, there's some potentiality for political resistance in here, because once the government see the capacity of the people to organize themselves and create their own political solidarity among the people beyond their, let's say, sector, beyond their limited region, that's the moment where when the government start to see that this kind of things can be challenged. So that's why in April, particularly in the case of People's Food Solidarity, the police dismissed the general meeting in Yogyakarta, because then this would be my speculation, but I think this is important to see that if the people are capable to unite themselves, there's some possibility to become a real political actor in Indonesia. And for me, this would be the general lesson that needs to be addressed by the left in Indonesia, because the problem in Indonesia is about the lack of stability factor. So when you are talking about class struggle right now, particularly coming from the working class, we have a lot of activity that coming from the working class. But the issue then, the struggle were too fragmented, too unorganized, and too spontaneous. And I think we need to have more coordination and unity. And what I mean in here is we have to start to further push our movement beyond sector and issue, not only about labor issue or environment issue, or even only merely about food issue, like what happens with the mutual aid so far, but more broader. And I think these only things can only be happen excuse me, if the very attempt to coordinate and unify all of the struggle captured or organized under some sort of political idea or political program. And the idea is not to merely challenge the state, but to provide the program that can be promoted by the state. And this require, I think, a leftist political party. And yeah, that would be my short presentation, because most of the things you guys has already presented here, and I'm just looking for a good discussion in here. Thank you, guys.
Thank you very much, Ridha. Perhaps you can stop sharing your screen.
Sorry, yeah.
So that we can, okay. Thank you very much. At the moment, we have one question by Roll E8. He asked, if the future is looking so bad for the economy, then what is your guess for how capitalism will save itself this time? Or will we be thrown into mayhem? Perhaps you can take turns to answer it. Perhaps with you first, Michael. So if the future is looking so bad for the economy, then what is your guess for how capitalism will save itself this time? Or will we be thrown into mayhem? Can you hear what I say?
Yes, I can. It's a good, very good question.
Yeah.
I think that my, as it were, dismal account of the state of the world economy and world capitalism, and of course, as a result, Indian capitalism, could make you feel like there is no hope. And certainly, that's a question which Mohammed has taken up, and we can perhaps discuss a bit later. But what will happen to capitalism? Well, how does capitalism solve slumps and crises that it gets into? It solves them basically in one way. It makes the workers pay for the crisis. How does it do that? Well, it can do so in the following way. If the criteria for capitalist recovery in terms of production, investment, and so on, is profitability. Capitalists don't invest and they don't produce unless they make a profit. And more importantly, they don't expand investment or expand production unless the profitability of their investments is rising. As I've shown, the profitability of investments is very low, both internationally and in Indonesia. And then now we have the slump. But a slump often offers the opportunity for capitalism to get out of a crisis. It means that workers are laid off from jobs that they had before. It means that old, weaker sectors of the capitalist economy go bust. So companies that aren't making any profit and are blocking the way for more vigorous companies that have got perhaps more investment potential, can do investment, can be removed. So if you like, you sweep away the weak, you reduce the income and living standards of the majority of the working people, partly by making them unemployed or holding their wages down. And in that way, the combination of that produces a rise in the profitability. We see at the end of each slump, there is a rise in the profitability of the capitalist economy, whether it's a national one or international. The question is how long that will last. Increasingly, it seems more difficult for the capitalist economies to turn profitability around and get it really moving on a sustained basis that will reach levels of growth and investment and GDP and incomes, finally, that we saw in the 60s and 70s. That doesn't seem to happen anymore because profitability remains very low. So a huge slump can help to turn things around for capitalism, particularly, of course, if workers have to submit to that slump through the loss of jobs. If workers are unable to seize control of the capitalist economy, the capitalists remain in control, and therefore after a period of time, they will be able to turn things around and stagger forward again for a period of time. Perhaps I was arguing on a relatively lower rate of growth than even before, but still able to survive. Marx once said there is no permanent crisis. There's no way when things just break down and that's the end of it. But the question is correct, that if profitability remains low, even if it recovers a bit, if capitalism is weak, then we will increasingly see tensions, not only between workers and capitalists, but also between workers, between capitalists themselves, between China and the US, between different countries struggling to get the smaller amount of profit. So that's going to increase the tensions in trade wars, in technology wars, and even outright wars. What happens from imperialist wars is a result of capitalism not being strong enough for everybody to get a share of the profits out of workers and being forced into struggles between them over the available profits that are coming out of the workers. So if you have low profits, we're going to see increased trade and technology and even military tensions around the world, which could lead to serious crises. That's the sort of mayhem which is on the horizon. So on the one hand, capitalism will survive unless the workers remove it, but capitalism will struggle to get back to the prosperity it's ever achieved before. And so we are entering the 21st century where the major danger is of imperialist rivalry and struggle between the major economic powers over a smaller and smaller cake.
Thank you, Michael. Ridha, do you have an answer to...
Yeah, I kind of think that we need to recall Rosa Luxemburg argument about barbarism or socialism in here, because the only things that we have if we fail to create a strong alternative against capitalism is definitely barbarism right now. And Michael has already provided such argument about the mayhem. Most of the solution that provided by the capitalists definitely will sacrifice the working class. And not only to the working class, but also even the environment and even the life itself. So it is important to have a quite clear and also solid anti-capitalist alternative right now. But the question is, who will provide that, right? And it's definitely not the job of the capitalism, of the capitalist class. It definitely is the task of the working class. And the problem right now is, even though the capitalism or the capitalism itself is definitely in the position of a weakness, but the power of the working class is weaker than the weakness of the capitalism itself. So we have this kind of dilemma in here, and I don't have any solid answer, but I have some speculation that probably might be some attempt that coming from the working class itself. But right now, unfortunately, we don't have any clear alternative that occur in our experience. So yeah, my argumentation might be not really optimistic, but I do believe that we need some sort of firm understanding that the only way to resolve current capitalist crisis definitely not coming from the capitalism itself. That's all.
How about you said that the working class...
Can I speak?
One moment. Who's asking? Amal?
Yes, it's me.
Okay, please.
It's
go
me.
on. Go on.
Yes. Ridho, for Ridho, I think your description about Indonesian government to handle the COVID-19, I think it's so narrow-minded, I think, because not any one country in the world can handle properly this pandemic. Even Robert's country also, England, it's very worse now. How the government handle this pandemic.
Yeah.
To blame the Indonesian government, I think it's not wise. It's not wise for the one side. It's better. Indonesia now it's better than other countries like India, for example. India, they choose lockdown is a solution for to handle the pandemic. But what happened? They abandoned 2 million migrant workers without transportation, without what we call food, and many other what we call solution for the migrant worker. But it's not happened in Indonesia because our government not choose the permanent lockdown for apa. That is what is the example. Indonesian is better than another country like India, for example. It is one example. That is why we cannot blame our government like this, like Ridha said. And then your data also about the COVID test. I think this I think this day, I think it is 1 million people have already tested by the government. And then in your what we call in your PowerPoint, it's only 500,000. And then another comment that I want to say in this forum for Robert also, and then Ridha also, it's because they use the Marxist perspective to see this pandemic, what we call this pandemic. But unfortunately, in my opinion, it is only good in analysis, but very less solution. Yeah, solution for the country like Indonesia, in the what we call in the periphery of the capitalism, the country in the periphery of capitalism. And that is the one of my comment. Another comment. How do you think? It is maybe for all speakers. I think China is one of the solution for Indonesia to make it cooperation, because we are now in the same boat in this situation. And then China, as one of the biggest economic country now, should make it more cooperation with the Indonesia. And then there is no one speaker talk about this relation. It is good or not, or you are afraid to say, because many Indonesian people don't like China in this time. But in my opinion, China is one alternative, yeah, to make it Indonesian economy. It's not dependent on with the center of the capitalism. What do you think about this? Yeah?
Okay, Amal, thank you very much.
Thank you. Yeah.
Before I let the speakers to answer your questions, thank you for your comments. Very insightful.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yes.
Perhaps you can mute your speaker for now. So in essence, Amal is saying that we should cooperate. Indonesia should cooperate with China and there are some flaws or some mistakes in the data, and the government, Indonesian government has done a lot of things, and this situation is faced by every government in the world who are also facing similar problems. So that's one from Amal. So I think there's two, yeah. One is, in essence, he's asking what's the solution from Marxist perspective. Should countries such as Indonesia cooperate with major economies such as China, given that in Indonesia there is a sentiment, negative sentiment towards China? So perhaps Ridha can answer, because Amal a question about your data just now, and then about the China question, and then can Roberts can follow. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Amal, for the question. That's really important question. But my idea in here is not really about analytical. The reason why I pick Marxism as an analysis in here is because it definitely has really applicative value. I mean, when you are talking about class struggle, it's about the idea that it's much better for all of us if the economic system is equal. I mean, equal in terms of providing more equal access to all people, providing more equal resource for all people. And when the state can be organized according to that value, it much better for us to live in that state. So the idea of Marxism with class struggle is not necessarily about this so-called of utopia or something that really beyond our imagination. No, it is really concrete. If the state can maintain that interest to be more equal to its own people, it can much better for the own citizen. And in here, when you are saying about India is worse than Indonesia, yeah, I can agree with that. But India has really important example that also needs to be highlighted in here, like in Kerala, the so-called the state of Kerala, they able to provide a really systematic and comprehensive protection for their own citizen, because the state was controlled by the working class, right? That's the idea of the Marxism in here. The idea of Marxism, yeah, you can say that there's a utopia there, but it's really practical, definitely. When you have the state controlled by the ordinary people, by the working class, you can ensure that the state won't be organized according to the so-called of logic of capital, right? So that's why it happens in Vietnam, it happens in Cuba, it happens in China, and I definitely on board with you. We definitely have to have cooperation with China. I don't have any problem with that, but the issue then, whose interest then being served in the state of Indonesia right now? And unfortunately, it is the interest of the capital that being served. And that's create the problem for us when the crisis or the pandemic hit the nation. Since the state being dominated by the capitalist class, definitely the state itself will be instrumentalized to serve the interests of the dominant class. So that's why Marxism in here is really useful, not only talking about the economy. And I think everyone will know that economy is, for us, is problematic right now, but it also provides some solution, I think. And Marxism provides quite clear solution that if you want to have a better life, better to create a better society. And if you want to create a better society, better create an equal state. And if you want to have an equal state, better to create a political organization that can have appropriate the state powers in accordance to that agenda. So that would be my simple answer to Amal's question. Thank you.
Thank you, Ridha. Perhaps I would follow up your answer later, because historically we have sort of managed, to challenge even the largest imperialistic power during early independence, right? But we know how it turned out. But perhaps Roberts can answer all the questions simultaneously. Yeah. So, is there a reduction in purchasing power in local currency rupiah by Fazlur Rahmat, if I'm not mistaken, as has happened in Argentina? And is the demand for wealth tax obligatory now to help Indonesia out of this crisis? You have answered through text, and I think people can read that. Also the China question, but perhaps you can voice out your answer, because this webinar is recorded also, so that people can easily access it later. Thank you, Michael.
Yes, it's a very good question by Amal, and also by whoever was originally asked a question about Argentina. All the global South economies that depend on commodities have suffered badly from trade and from outflows of capital by the big multinationals, and investment institutions have taken their money away. And as a result, the currencies of these countries have collapsed, and that includes the Indonesian rupiah. It's dropped quite sharply. But Indonesia isn't quite in the situation of Argentina, where it's basically defaulting on its debts, because Argentina has huge external debts in dollars and has done so for decades. It's been unable to clear those. It's defaulted a couple of times. Its currency is very weak, and everybody switches into dollars. So the Argentine economy is in a much more seriously difficult position than the Indonesian one is. But nevertheless, all these countries during the COVID pandemic and lockdown and slump are now suffering. The question originally asked, well, maybe we need a wealth tax to redistribute the huge inequalities that exist in Indonesia and elsewhere in wealth and income. I'm sure that would help. All I would say is that it would have to probably be international, because if one country introduces a wealth tax in order to tax the rich will try to take their money elsewhere to different countries, and they will try to hold the government to ransom with a wealth tax, which is why even the best and well-meaning governments, and there are not really many of those, because they're more in the interests of the multinationals and the rich than they are in taxing them, even if they were to do that, they would face problems. Any problem is going to be difficult for one leftist government, if we had such a thing in Indonesia or elsewhere, to deal with an international capitalist crisis and the attitude of international capital and their own capitalists. They will face tremendous pressure. A wealth tax would be a step, but actually the only way you're really going to permanently get a government in a position to actually help the people is by taking over the major sectors of the economy which is held by the multinationals and by domestic business and finance. You need public ownership of the banks. You need public ownership of strategic sectors of the economy. You need a monopoly and control of trade, so that you can stop the flow of capital out of the country by capitalists trying to break the government. That's a major, major program, which basically requires the mobilization of the working class to achieve it. Now, China had a revolution in 1949, where basically that's what they did. The Chinese Communist Party expropriated the agricultural landlords and the warlords who fled to Taiwan, and they introduced the planned economy. That planned economy has been gradually changed, and now it's a sizable section of the Chinese economy has a private sector and capitalist sector, but it's still the case economically that the state controls investment on the whole, production on the whole, currency and trade, and it's in a position therefore to expand the economy even if profitability is low in other countries. Profitability low in other countries means they stop investment, but in China that's not the case. And so we have to ask ourselves, why has the Chinese model led to a massive increase in production and output per year in China, taking over 800 million people out of that poverty level I was talking about before that the World Bank sets? No other countries achieve that. India, Indonesia haven't achieved it because they've got some control through the state over investment and planning, unlike other countries. Of course, they don't have democracy. This is a one-party state. This is a dictatorship of a bureaucracy. this is repression of people who have different views, but then that applies in many capitalist economies as well. The government operate in a similar way. So when I'm looking at the economy, and rather than the question of political democracy, I can see that the Chinese model works better. And that's what Amal's, I think, is suggesting or questioning. I think Indonesia had a Chinese type model in terms of the economy, state control and planning of the major sectors of the economy. It could improve the lot of the people dramatically because it would start to be able to invest without profitability being the criteria. But also, you could only succeed eventually by having full democratic accountability and control by the working class. That doesn't exist in China. So inequalities in China are very high, like they are in Indonesia. But it certainly seems that if you're able to reduce the ability of the law of value and profitability to operate in the economy, and you can invest for social need rather than profit, you can make big progress even in this world capitalist economy we are at the moment.
Thank you, Michael. I would like to follow up the questions here. Ridha has suggested that Indonesia needs to have a left party or a leftist-oriented party. And the history for leftist party in Indonesia is not a happy history. Yeah? It was crushed. The Indonesian Communist Party, the largest party, communist party in the world, in fact, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah. And at the moment, the Indonesian law still outlaws any party that or any dissemination of Marxist Leninist teaching. In fact, I was a bit worried for this webinar. Therefore, I checked the law, but I decided since the websites of Indo Progress, and then we have lots of left-leaning websites and left-leaning discussions. Although some of the books, some of these discussions are still so-called banned or outlawed, or the police came to disband the discussion and came to confiscate the books. So this is the very real problem for Indonesia right now, which Michael might not know. So in the face of all these restrictions, I think, is it still fruitful to approach these problems from a leftist party angle, or more towards what you said, mutual aid, mass organization, which need not be a political party. Also, Michael, it's very interesting that you said that China is a non-democracy. Therefore, even with all their problems, they still have some progress, yeah, in terms of lifting their people out of poverty and all that. So, what do you think of the development of democracies around the world? You know, like we have so-called right now, a lot of foreign observers, foreign academics are saying Indonesia is facing an illiberal democracy, So, do we then question whether democracy is beneficial, or whether other models are feasible, like in China, for example, or yeah, perhaps you can enlighten us after Ridha. Perhaps Ridha can answer the questions first. On to you, Ridha.
Well, in my view, we have to ask the question, what is democracy? And the working class around the world has struggled to get levels of democracy. What I mean by that is free speech, that we can have meetings like this without police coming and arresting us for having dissident views. That also we can publish material to convince people of our opinions, to get changes in policy without fear of arrest, and that we can demonstrate in the streets if we need to do so, that we can go on strike in our workplaces if we feel that's necessary, and that we have the right to vote in or vote out the existing government officials that are running the country for us. Those rights took hundreds and hundreds of years in Europe and around the world to achieve. So they're not to be dismissed. But that is not enough for real social democracy, because I don't know, in the United States, they get to vote once every 4 years between two millionaire finance parties about how to run capitalism. That's their only option. Perhaps a similar situation in Indonesia. In Europe, we get the option every 4 or 5 years to vote for an outright capitalist supporting party, or another party which claims to be supporting the workers but actually wants to maintain capitalism. Those are the options we have, and we only get a vote once every 5 years at one particular point. There is no regular democratic accountability of our officials throughout the weeks, the months, or in our workplace. Workers have no control over what's happening in their workplace. So we don't have real democracy in any country in the world. And in my view, that would only be possible if we move towards a more socialist model. And that includes China. China may have a much more powerful economic model to take us forward while we don't have world socialism, which would be the best solution. But it's certainly not democracy. People are arrested, repressed, put in concentration camps if they're dissident, and so on. So everywhere, there is only certain levels of democracy. I'll finish on this point, Surya, and the meeting, that if this intense struggle between the capitalists is going to develop, and if these slumps continue to be severe, that cause more tensions on the class struggle between workers and capitalists, capitalists will dispense with democracy in the countries that claim to be liberal democracies. We're seeing that in the US, where Trump flouts the law daily. We're seeing that in Brazil, where the president flouts the law. We're seeing that in Turkey, where basically they've abolished any real democratic rights. We see that in Russia. So the idea of liberal democracies being the model that we should set ourselves, firstly, they're very limited. And secondly, they're fast disappearing because capitalism is prepared to get rid of them if they're not working in maintaining its interests and look for more autocratic methods. Don't forget, in the 1930s, capitalism resorted to outright fascism and military dictatorships, which took a world war to get rid of, and also after the war, took colonial struggles to get rid of military regimes run by imperialists, and in Europe to get rid of military regimes in Spain, Portugal, Greece, and Italy during the 50s, 60s, and 70s. So we certainly don't want to say, because liberal democracies are not full democracies, that we should forget about those democratic rights. We need to defend those democratic rights and take them much further.
Thank you, Michael. Ridha, perhaps I schedule the webinar 2 hours until 9:30, but if the speakers are available, we can continue. But if not, we can finish at 9:30. And also, I think there are no more questions I can see, but perhaps if there are more, please feel free. Ridha, so I'll repeat the question, about leftist party, and also perhaps your idea, your comment about democracy also. Thank you.
I'll probably have to go after 2 hours, Julia. Yeah.
Okay, so 5 minutes, 5 more minutes, Michael. 5 more minutes, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so basically about the leftist parties, I'm not really interested about the ideology in here. I'm just really interested about the practicality. I mean, as Michael said before about the importance of state nationalization, the importance of taking control of the main economic sector, what kind of instrument that we can that can ensure that realization. And I don't see any possibility that's coming from the mutual aid or mass organization. It has to be coming from the state power. And state power can only be organized if you have political parties, if you have political organizations. So that's why the reason for the leftist party is not really about ideology. It starts from the material condition of the struggle itself. And the reason for the importance of the leftist parties, regardless of this problem in Indonesia, it's still there, right? So if you ask whether Indonesian can cope with current condition where the state still disallow leftist organization, for me, it's a question of strategy and tactics, how we can outmaneuver such regulation. And if you ask me whether we have right now leftist party, yes, definitely. There are several leftist parties in Indonesia, but most of them can be considered as illegal right now. And the idea is, right now, if you see from the history of the leftist party all around the world, they always start with state repression, right? Even the Bolshevik, the Communist Party of Russia, they start with the repression that's coming from the Tsar. So it's not really unique to our problem. The question right now, what kind of strategy, what kind of tactics that we want to conduct when we want to establish our own leftist party? That's the real question. Or to put in Lenin's question, what is to be done, right?
Thank you very much, Ridha. Thank you very much, Michael.
Thank you.
Any last words before we end this meeting, Michael?
No, I think I've spoken enough. I don't know if Muhammad wants to say anything.
Okay, thank you very much. I will contact you later through emails, and I will upload this into YouTube, and I'll send you also. And have a good day. Have a good weekend there, Michael. Thank you.
And thank everybody for coming. Thank you very much.
Yes. Ridha, makasih banyak. Ya, sampai jumpa
sama-sama.
lagi. Nanti saya akan kita akan berkirim surel ke elektronik. Oke, terima kasih. Thank you everyone. Terima kasih semuanya sudah hadir.
Bye.
And let's meet again in another webinar series by Literacy Coffee. Peace.
Bye.